Elijah sat rigidly in seat 1A, his heart pounding like the throb of the engines overhead. Even though he had flown several times with his father, Gregory Johnson, this was the first time he was alone in first class. The cabin smelled faintly of new leather and lemon polish, the kind of scent that instantly marks a space as elite. Outside the window, the wing reflected the last rays of the setting sun, painting the sky in bands of orange and gold. He ran a finger along the quilted texture of the seat back. Each diamond stitch felt like a reminder that this moment was a gift from his father, the renowned CEO of Johnson Innovations. Elijah closed his eyes for a second, trying to steady himself, inhaling the cool, conditioned air, and reminding himself that he belonged here just as much as anyone else. He glanced at his watch, an understated analog face on a brown leather strap, the kind his father preferred for its timeless elegance. At age 15, Elijah already understood the power of perception. While other kids his age were more interested in video games or sneakers, he spent weekends shadowing his dad in boardrooms, learning how a casual word could shift millions of dollars. Today, however, he simply wanted to enjoy the moment. Gregory had insisted he take this trip alone to build confidence, assuring him over breakfast that he could handle anything life threw at him, especially things nobody expected a teenager to endure. A soft chime announced the flight attendant's arrival. She paused beside him, her crisp navy uniform immaculate down to its brass buttons, and offered a warm smile. "Would you like something to drink, Mr. Johnson?" she asked, her voice measured and kind. The glass trolley beside her gleamed with polished metal and crystal decanters. "Yes, please, I'll have some orange juice," Elijah replied, trying to sound composed. She poured precisely 6 ounces into a slender glass and handed it to him with a nod of approval. As the cool liquid slid down his throat, he felt a rush of pride. This was more than luxury. It was a lesson in self-worth that Gregory had taught him long ago. Elijah turned back to the window, watching clouds drift by below, when the sound of sharp heels echoed down the aisle. The click grew louder, demanding attention even in a cabin designed for serenity. He glanced up to see a woman stepping into the VIP section. Her designer coat, a soft cream color, tailored so perfectly it looked painted on. Her name badge read Stokes, and her poise bore the kind of entitlement only years of unchecked status could grant. She paused beneath the compartment lights, scanning the passengers with thinly veiled disdain. Everything about her screamed wealth. The gold buckle on her belt, the discreet diamond studs in her ears, the faint scent of jasmine and something sharper he couldn't name. Mrs. Stokes fixed Elijah with a look so frosty it felt as though icicles formed around him. She sighed loudly, as if offended by the very air he breathed, and snapped, "Flight attendant!" When the young woman in navy stepped forward, Mrs. Stokes glared at the seat map on the attendant's tablet and spat out, "There's been a mistake. That seat belongs to me. A boy, an adolescent boy, should not be sitting in first class." Her voice ricocheted off the overhead bins, causing a few nearby passengers to crane their necks. The attendant's fingers flew across the screen as she double-checked the reservation. "I'm so sorry, ma'am, but seat 1A is reserved for Elijah Johnson," she replied as politely as she could muster. Mrs. Stokes's lips curled into a sneer. "You must be joking. Do you have any idea who I am? I hold platinum elite status. I fly this route twice a month. I pay more in a single year than some people earn in a lifetime." Elijah's chest tightened. He clutched the glass so hard that condensation slipped down his fingers, but he forced himself not to spill a drop. He remembered Gregory's calm instructions, always stay measured. Still, each word Mrs. Stokes hurled felt like a cruel knife carving doubt into him. The attendant attempted another peaceful resolution. "Mrs. Johnson, perhaps you might consider another seat, just as comfortable, so that Mrs. Stokes can settle in?" She lifted her eyes to the woman, but Mrs. Stokes turned her contempt back on Elijah. her voice cold and dripping with superiority. "No, I will not consider anything. That boy is old enough to know his place." Heat pooled in Elijah's cheeks. Every gaze in the aisle seemed to bore into him, some curious, some sympathetic, most uncomfortable. He raised his head and met Mrs. Stokes's icy stare, determined not to shrink away. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said quietly but firmly. "This is my seat. I will not move." Each syllable was coded in the politeness his father had drilled into him, yet underneath lay an unspoken defiance. Around him, the cabin fell silent, as though the pressurized walls themselves were holding their breath. Mrs. Stokes' expression twisted into fury. She leaned in until her designer coat brushed against his shoulder, lowering her voice so that only he could hear. "You ungrateful child," she hissed. "You do not deserve an ounce of this privilege. I will not have some nigger sitting here just because his daddy bought his way in." The word landed like a bomb, the cabin's temperature dropping in an instant. Elijah felt his mouth go dry, shock and humiliation swirling inside him like a storm. Passengers stiffened, some grimacing, others glancing away, unwilling to witness the ugliness. The flight attendant's face turned ashen. Mrs. Stokes pressed the tablet against her thigh as if it were suddenly too hot to hold. Without a word, the attendant glanced at Elijah, her eyes apologetic, then strode off toward the back of the plane. She needed help, a supervisor, anything to defuse this disaster. Elijah sank back into his seat, every muscle trembling. How could someone be so hateful in a cabin meant for refinement? He clenched his jaw, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He was Gregory's son, and Gregory had taught him never to let bigotry break his spirit. Whispers rippled through the first-class cabin. One passenger tightened the folds of her cashmere wrap. Another lifted a smartphone as though poised to record. Elijah focused on the steady hum of the engines and the muted glow of the panel lights above him. He pictured his father's steady hand at the boardroom table, remembered the pride in his voice when he said, "I trust you to do the right thing." In that moment, he found the last bit of courage left in him. "No," he thought, "I will not let her shame me." Minutes later, hurried footsteps approached, echoing down the aisle like a drum roll. A tall woman in her 40s appeared at the threshold of first class. Deborah Lane, the flight supervisor. Her uniform was impeccable, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, and a navy scarf tied like a ribbon around her neck. She paused, sweeping her gaze across the tense scene, the flush on Mrs. Stokes's cheeks, the rigid posture of Elijah in the plush seat, the uneasy tilt of the attendant's shoulders. She offered a calm, professional smile as she stepped forward. "I understand there is an issue here," she began, her voice smooth as silk but carrying the authority of someone accustomed to resolving crises. Elijah lifted his chin, meeting her gaze without wavering. Mrs. Stokes crossed her arms, her jaw set. The cabin crackled with expectation. As Deborah consulted her attendant, Elijah felt something shift inside him, an ember of confidence that no insult, no matter how vile, could extinguish. He was ready for whatever came next, knowing that sometimes justice arrives on wings. Elijah sat back down, his heart still racing from Evelyn Stokes's furious outburst. He felt the weight of every passenger's stare pressing into his shoulders, but he refused to let their eyes shake him. He closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath, picturing his father's steady face. Gregory Johnson had always told him that courage did not mean never feeling fear. It meant moving forward even when your knees trembled. Deborah Lane stood frozen for a heartbeat longer than felt comfortable. Her mind raced through airline policy manuals, customer service protocols, and legal liability. On one side was a platinum elite passenger threatening a scandal. On the other was a 15-year-old boy whose only crime was claiming the seat his father had purchased for him. She knew which side was right. She just had to find the words to say it. "Mrs. Stokes," she began, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest. "I understand your frustration. No one wants to see a flight delayed. However," she paused, letting that word land like a gavel, "Mr. Johnson's reservation is valid. Our records confirm it. If you would like to move to an equally comfortable seat, we can offer seat 2A or 2B. But if you insist on seat 1A, you will need to wait until Mr. Johnson has completed his journey." Evelyn's face reddened to match the first-class cabin's burgundy carpet. She rounded on Deborah. "You cannot be serious. I demand to sit here. I will not leave my rightful seat." A few passengers shifted in their seats. One elderly woman in a cashmere shawl leaned closer to her husband and whispered. Another man in a navy sports jacket cleared his throat, glancing at the bulkhead phone as if contemplating dialing something. All eyes flicked to Elijah's phone as he stood up again, straightening his jacket collar. "I'm going to make a call," he said. He spoke quietly but clearly, and the cabin fell into hushed silence once more. He stepped toward the curtain and turned back, looking Deborah in the eye. "Please, give me a moment." Deborah simply nodded. She had to trust that this boy had some plan. He disappeared behind the blue curtain, leaving a trail of jittery passengers and a seething Evelyn Stokes. Inside the galley, the space was cramped but felt like a sanctuary. Elijah's hands trembled as he dialed his father's number. The phone rang 3 times before Gregory's calm voice answered. "Elijah, what is going on?" "Dad," he said, holding back his emotion. "There's a woman named Evelyn Stokes in first class. She's refusing to let me sit in seat ton A, even though you reserved it for me. She's threatening to involve her lawyer and the press if I don't move. The supervisor is giving in to her." He swallowed hard. "I don't know what to do." There was a pause. Then Gregory said, "Stay calm and keep your composure. That's the most important thing. I'm calling the airline headquarters right now. I'll get you an answer in 5 minutes. Do you understand?" Elijah nodded, though his father could not see him. "Yes, Dad, 5 minutes." "Good. I'll handle this. You're doing great. Keep your seat warm for me. I'll have this turned around." Elijah let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. "Thank you, Dad." He ended the call and straightened his tie. He rehearsed his father's words and walked back out into first class. Every pair of eyes tracked him, including Evelyn's, which glared like a dagger aimed at his back. "Mrs. Stokes," he said, his voice low but carrying through the cabin. "My father, Mr. Gregory Johnson, is personally handling the matter. He just called headquarters and is speaking with the president of the airline now. He asked that I remain in my seat. He promised resolution within minutes." Evelyn's mouth opened, then closed. She looked to Deborah, who gave a small nod. Deborah stepped beside Elijah and addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats. We anticipate resuming service in a few minutes. Thank you for your patience." Evelyn huffed and crossed her arms, but she no longer had the floor. The cabin lights reflected off her diamond earrings like tiny spotlights. She cleared her throat, but had nothing to say. The passengers returned to their magazines, phones, and conversations, though a few offered Elijah sympathetic smiles. Behind the curtain in the galley, Elijah heard the thrum of activity. Flight attendants whispered into headsets, and overhead he could almost hear the creak of corporate wheels turning in the airline's nerve center. He closed his eyes and pictured his father's unwavering confidence. 4 minutes later, a second call came through. This time, Elijah answered quickly. "Elijah, this is your father. The airline president has personally intervened. She apologizes for the mishandling and has ordered that Mrs. Stokes surrender seat 1A to you immediately. Furthermore, as a gesture of goodwill, she is offering you a complimentary upgrade on your next transcontinental flight with private lounge access at no extra cost." There was a pause. "You did well. Keep calm for just a little longer. I'll be there soon." Elijah grinned. "Thank you, Dad. I'll stay right here." He hung up and stepped back into the aisle. Deborah Lane was waiting, her professional poise restored. "Mr. Johnson," she said, almost smiling now, "I have an update. The airline president sends her apologies to you and to all passengers. Mrs. Stokes is required to move to seat 2A. We will send you an apology letter and a voucher for your next flight. Thank you for your patience and dignity." With that, a tall flight attendant approached Mrs. Stokes and gently informed her of the change. Evelyn's jaw tightened, her lips pressed into a thin line. She glared at Elijah one last time, then stalked down the aisle toward her new seat, her platinum status crushed by corporate fiat. As Evelyn crossed the aisle, passengers applauded quietly. A ripple of approving murmurs went through first class. Some raised their glasses of champagne. Others offered Elijah thumbs up. The elderly woman in cashmere gave him a nod like a secret sign of respect. Elijah perched on the edge of his seat, heart swelling with relief and pride. Deborah Lane leaned toward him and whispered, "You were impressive, very impressive." Elijah smiled. "Thank you, Miss Lane. It was my father's advice that got me through it." Deborah nodded. "Your father did well. You both did well." For the rest of the flight, Elijah settled back into his seat. The engine noise now felt like applause. He looked out the window at the dark sky dotted with stars, thinking about how a 15-year-old boy had stood up to anger, prejudice, and a woman who thought status trumped dignity. He thought about his father's call, how Gregory Johnson had stepped in not with anger but with calm authority. When the plane finally landed in New York, Elijah was the last to leave first class. He gave a small nod to Deborah, who was checking her tablet. She smiled and handed him the apology letter in a navy envelope with gold lettering and the voucher for the lounge access. He tucked both into his jacket pocket. Outside the jet bridge, Gregory Johnson was waiting. He stood next to a black luxury sedan with tinted windows and his driver's door open. When Elijah appeared, his father embraced him. A rare show of emotion from the CEO. "You did great," Gregory said, his voice soft. "I heard everything." Elijah looked up at his father. "I was scared, but I remembered what you told me." Gregory nodded. "Dignity and respect. You taught everyone on that plane how to sit up for themselves." Elijah smiled shyly. "And you taught me how to handle it." They walked together toward the sedan. Reporters and paparazzi that usually swarmed could not find purchase on this quiet midnight. It was a father and son moment. No flashbulbs, no headlines, just a shared triumph over prejudice and injustice. Later that night, when Elijah was finally home and tucked into bed, Gregory sat at his desk and placed the apology letter in a frame. It sat next to a family photo and a quote Gregory lived by. "Character is measured when you stand for what is right, even when you stand alone." Elijah drifted to sleep with a sense of pride. He had faced hatred, isolation, and the threat of scandal, but he had also felt solidarity from strangers, the power of calm authority, and the unwavering support of his father. He knew that this night would shape him for the rest of his life, and that someday he would tell the story to his own children, reminding them that dignity and justice were worth every ounce of courage. And somewhere far above the clouds, a powerful CEO of a tech empire smiled, knowing his son had learned the most important lesson of all. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains as Elijah Johnson stirred awake in his room. He blinked at the ceiling and for a moment felt the weight of the previous night's ordeal pressing down on him again. In the quiet calm of dawn, he felt his chest tighten, memories of Mrs. Stokes's hateful words rushing back. He forced himself to sit up slowly, rubbing his eyes, and recalled his father's promise that the matter was in hand. He knew that behind the scenes, Gregory Johnson was already setting things right. It was just a matter of time before the world would see the full story. Downstairs in the kitchen, the aroma of fresh coffee mingled with warm pancakes. Gregory was at the table, already dressed in a charcoal gray suit, his tie loosened just a bit so it looked relaxed. He greeted Elijah with a reassuring smile. "Good morning, son," he said softly. "How did you sleep?" Elijah hesitated, then shrugged, admitting, "It was okay, Dad." I kept thinking about her words. Gregory reached across the table, resting his hand on Elijah's shoulder. "I know," he said. "No one should have to face that kind of disrespect, but you handled it with more grace than most adults would manage. I am proud of you." Elijah looked down at his cereal, spoon stirring the milk in small circles. It was the same cereal they ate every Saturday, blueberry granola. Yet today it tasted sweeter. "I just wanted it to be over," he confessed. "I felt so small when she called me names." Gregory nodded, his face softening. "It is natural to feel that way. Prejudice cuts deep because it attacks who we are. But remember, son, the real measure of a person is not how they treat you, but how you respond, and you responded with strength and dignity." After breakfast, they drove to the Johnson Innovations headquarters. The building rose 30 stories above the city streets, its glass facade reflecting morning traffic in ribbons of light. As they entered the lobby, Elijah noticed a small gathering of reporters by the security desk. Cameras and notepads were at the ready. His heart fluttered. "Dad," he whispered, "are they here for me?" Gregory squeezed his hand and guided him past the others. They had arranged a press briefing at 9 o'clock. "I wanted you to have a chance to speak," he explained. "You have a voice, and I want people to hear what you have to say." Elijah swallowed. He had never spoken to a crowd of strangers like this, but when he stepped onto the stage in the lobby, flanked by his father and Deborah Lane standing politely behind them, the nerves melted away. Reporters called out, "What will you say? What do you want the airline to do?" Elijah looked out at the flashing lights and cameras. He took a deep breath, recalling every lesson his father had taught him about honesty and calm authority. "My name is Elijah Johnson," he began, his voice steady. "Yesterday I was a boy who wanted to enjoy a flight. I was proud to sit in the seat my father reserved for me, but I experienced racism and threats simply because of my skin color. That was painful, but I want to thank the airline for ultimately standing up for what was right. I want to thank the passengers who showed support, and I want to tell every young person out there, do not think that insults and fear define you. Your dignity and respect come from within. Hold your head high and do what you know is right." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. A few cameras zoomed in on Elijah's calm expression. Gregory stepped forward, addressing the business press and travel reporters. He announced that Johnson Innovations would be creating a scholarship fund for students facing discrimination. The fund would cover college expenses and mentorship programs. "We want to ensure that no young person ever feels powerless because of prejudice," he said. "Together, we can turn one ugly incident into a catalyst for positive change." Within hours, the video of Elijah's statement was trending on social media. Viewers across the country praised his maturity and courage. Hashtags like "Stand with Elijah" and "Dignity Matter" flooded platforms. News outlets interviewed families who said they would tell their children about Elijah's example. Even Evelyn Stokes' name became attached to condemnation, her threatened lawsuit backfiring as public opinion turned sharply against her. She was painted as the antagonist in a story of resilience. At the airline's corporate office, an internal memo circulated. The CEO apologized and announced a new zero tolerance for discrimination policy, requiring all staff to undergo training and creating a clear reporting system for incidents. A copy of Elijah's press statement was pinned to the memo's header, a reminder that one boy's voice can inspire company-wide reform. Meanwhile, Deborah Lane found herself promoted to Senior Customer Experience Manager. Her decisive support for Elijah and her refusal to yield to prejudice marked her as a leader. When she walked through the halls of the airline's Chicago headquarters a week later, employees greeted her with nods and smiles. She carried herself with renewed confidence, knowing she had done the right thing under immense pressure. Back home, Elijah spent the next few days settling into his routine. but with a new spark in his spirit. At school, his classmates approached him differently. Some asked for selfies, others shared their own stories of unfair treatment. In history class, when the teacher discussed civil rights, Elijah raised his hand and shared how sitting firm in seat 1A felt like standing alongside the heroes he had read about. People who refused to be moved. Evelyn Stokes' fate unfolded quietly but decisively. The airline revoked her platinum elite status and canceled her annual fee refund. She received a letter outlining the policy violation and a ban from first class for 1 year. Her threat to sue was met with a countersuit for defamation, though that was settled confidentially. In the months that followed, she flew economy 3 times because she refused to apologize or show news about her downfall circulated in travel blogs, and some of her social circles distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone who had publicly humiliated a child. For Elijah, the most lasting impact was the scholarship fund in his name. Each semester, he read applications from students who had faced bullying, racism, or other forms of injustice. He wrote letters of encouragement and sometimes met scholarship recipients at company events. Seeing young people flourish gave him a profound sense of purpose. He realized that one moment of courage can ripple outward, touching many lives. A year later, at the Johnson Innovations annual gala, Elijah stood beside his father as they unveiled the first group of scholarship winners. The room was filled with dignitaries, teachers, and families whose lives had been changed. When one of the students spoke about how witnessing Elijah's stand gave her the courage to pursue medicine despite stereotypes, Elijah felt tears in his eyes. He put his arm around his father and gripped the lectern. Even in a crowd of grown-ups, his heart pounded with the same mixture of nerves and pride he had felt on the plane. After the formal presentations, people gathered in small groups, sharing stories. An airline executive told Gregory that the airline's customer satisfaction scores had risen 10 points since the policy change. Deborah Lane hugged Elijah and joked that she might need to take lessons from him on staying calm under pressure. Reports showed a 50% decrease in reported in-fleet discrimination incidents. It seemed a single incident had sparked meaningful corporate and cultural reform. Later that evening, as they walked back to the limousine under a canopy of city lights, Elijah asked his father, "Dad, do you think my life will always be tied to that flight?" Gregory considered this. "In one sense, yes," he said. "That moment defined you as someone who stands up for what is right. But in another sense, it was just the beginning. Your life will be defined by every choice you make moving forward." Elijah nodded thoughtfully. He realized that courage, once tested, becomes part of who you are. He gazed at the skyline and imagined future challenges, perhaps in college or his career, and felt ready. Because he had faced hate head-on, he knew that dignity was a shield no one could take away. When they arrived home, Gregory guided Elijah to the study, where the framed apology letter and the quote, "Character is measured when you stand for what is right, even when you stand alone," still hung. He placed his hand on his son's shoulder. "Keep this in mind whenever you doubt yourself," he said. "You carried our family name with honor. You made people feel seen and respected. That is the real journey." Elijah smiled and looked at the framed apology. The clean, cursive script below the airline's logo reminded him that sometimes the most powerful words are written in ink. He whispered, "Thank you, Dad, for trusting me." And then quieter, "Thank you, Mom, for teaching me kindness." He did not need to say the rest, because the lesson had already taken root deep in his heart. That night, as Elijah drifted into sleep, he dreamed of being on a stage once more. Not in a corporate lobby, but in schools, community centers, and public forums, speaking about respect, dignity, and justice. He knew that while one flight had tested his resolve, the world would offer many more opportunities to stand firm. And when those moments came, he would remember how it felt to sit tall in seat 1A, eyes calm, voice steady, heart unshakable. And somewhere, in the quiet of the night sky, planes continued to cross continents, carrying passengers of every background. But thanks to one 15-year-old boy and the unwavering support of his father and an airline supervisor named Deborah Lane, one more story had been written. A story of courage, of change, and of justice that reminded everyone who heard it that dignity belongs to us all. Elijah Johnson sat perfectly still in seat ton A, his gaze fixed ahead, even though his mind raced faster than the engine's hum. He felt the invisible finger of every passenger's stare, the weight of Evelyn Stokes' arrogant glare drilling into him like an ice pick. His chest tightened, but he reminded himself of Gregory's words, "Dignity is what earns respect." He inhaled slowly, counting to 5, and exhaled. Then he straightened his back and folded his hands calmly in his lap. Across the aisle, Evelyn's posture was pure triumph. Her shoulders squared, lips curled in a self-satisfied smirk. She tapped her manicured nail twice against the armrest, as though it were a gavel, announcing her victory. Deborah Lane stood uneasily beside her, shifting from one foot to the other, her professional mask cracking around the edges. Flight attendant Greg hovered awkwardly a few paces behind, gleaming name tag reflecting the overhead lights as he glanced toward Deborah, pleading silently for guidance. Then the cabin door swung open with a soft click that sounded louder than anything Elijah had ever heard. Every head snapped toward the entry. 2 men in well-tailored black suits strode into view, stern, no-nonsense faces, each carrying a sense of authority so powerful it made the cabin floor seem to tremble. They were the airline's senior representatives, and their appearance here meant no ordinary customer complaint. They had arrived to deliver justice. The taller of the two, a silver-haired man with eyes like cold steel, stepped forward. He scanned the cabin swiftly, taking in the tension etched on every face, then zeroed in on Deborah Lane and Greg. He lifted a hand as if to hush the entire section. "I am Robert Evans, Senior Representative of Continental Wings Airlines," he announced, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "We have been alerted to a serious breach of policy aboard Flight 507. I demand an immediate explanation." Deborah Lane's mouth opened once, then closed. She looked at Greg, whose face had turned ashen. They both knew this was far more severe than a routine seat mix-up. Deborah cleared her throat, trying to steady herself. "Mr. Evans," she began, voice wavering, "I was attempting to prevent a delay. Mrs. Stokes insisted that seat 1A has always been hers. I suggested we offer the boy another seat so we could depart on time." Evans's lips pressed into a thin line. He shook his head slowly. "You sided with the passenger making the disturbance, instead of protecting a valid reservation," he said, each word dropping like a hammer. "Is that how Continental Wings resolves conflicts? By rewarding arrogance and ignoring legitimate rights?" Deborah's eyes filled with tears as she stuttered, I thought I was under pressure to avoid a scene." Before she could say more, Evans turned and addressed the cabin, his tone shifting to sincere apology. "To the young man in seat ton A, Mr. Johnson, I offer my deepest apologies. Your reservation was honored by policy and contract. No passenger, regardless of status, has the right to usurp another's seat under any circumstances. We will rectify this situation immediately." With a sharp movement, Evans nodded to his colleague, a younger man with dark hair and alert eyes. The second representative, Matthew Hughes, stepped forward and spoke directly to Greg. "Please escort Mrs. Stokes to seat 2A. She will be accommodated there, and we will personally assist her with any further needs. Then, young man," he said, turning to Elijah, "we will bring you refreshments and an apology gift. Is there anything you require right now?" Evelyn Stokes's face blanched, the smug confidence drained from her features, replaced by shock, then fury. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Deborah Lane seized a headset and whispered instructions to Greg, who gently guided Evelyn away, his hand on her arm a reluctant escort rather than a respectful guide. The cabin erupted in a hushed ripple of relief and approving murmurs. Some passengers offered Elijah sympathetic smiles, others raised glasses of sparkling water in a silent toast to his victory. Elijah's chest swelled with relief, though his heart still thumped from adrenaline. He nodded once to Evans, offering a small, grateful smile. Evans inclined his head, his stern expression softening out of respect. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "thank you for your patience and composure. You have demonstrated the respect that all passengers deserve." Greg returned moments later with a glass of chilled apple juice on a silver tray and a small box wrapped in navy paper bearing the airline's crest. "For you," Greg said quietly, setting them on Elijah's tray table. "Our sincerest apologies." Elijah accepted the glass and box without a word, the sincerity in Greg's eyes giving him a second breath of courage. He took a delicate sip, cool juice sliding through him, and opened the box to reveal a leather-bound travel journal embossed with his initials. The gift stung in its kindness. It was a symbolic acknowledgement of how far he had been wronged. As the senior representatives prepared to leave, Evans paused at the threshold. "Continental Wings Airlines is committed to zero tolerance for discrimination," he said. "Let this incident serve as a reminder that respect is not optional. Enjoy the rest of your flight, Mr. Johnson." With that, he and Hughes turned on their heels and strode back down the aisle, leaving silence in their wake. Deborah Lane exhaled deeply and approached Elijah. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice soft. "I should have protected you from the start." Elijah shook his head gently. "You did the right thing in the end," he replied. "We all learn under pressure." She managed a tired smile. "I wish I had learned sooner." A few minutes later, the flight attendant resumed beverage service, offering Elijah extra snacks and warm towels. The cabin mood had shifted from tension to solidarity. Passengers who had been spectators now felt complicit in Evelyn's wrongdoing, and many whispered praises for Elijah's steadfast courage. Across the aisle, in seat 2A, Evelyn sat stiffly, arms folded and lips pressed into a thin line. She glared at Elijah but could no longer muster her former arrogance. The seat beside her remained empty, a silent reminder of her defeat. Every time she glanced at Elijah, she caught him gazing out the window, serene and untroubled. Her defeat was absolute and public. When the flight finally made its announcements to prepare for landing, Elijah felt a quiet triumph settle over him. He closed his eyes and whispered a soft prayer of thanks for his father's guidance, for Deborah's final stand, and for the universal principle that no amount of status can trump a person's rightful dignity. Moments later, the plane touched down smoothly at JFK. As passengers stood to deplane, many sought Elijah out to shake his hand or offer a kind word. A middle-aged couple stopped beside him. "Young man," the woman said, her voice warm with emotion, "you showed all of us what true courage looks like. Thank you." Elijah blushed but nodded. "Thank you," he replied softly. "I just did what felt right." Outside the gate, Gregory Johnson waited beside his black sedan, cell phone in hand, suit jacket draped over his arm. When Elijah stepped off the jet bridge, he saw his father's proud smile and quickened his pace. At the bottom of the stairs, they embraced, two generations united by respect and resilience. "I heard everything," Gregory said quietly. "I'm so proud of you." Elijah looked up at his father, eyes shining. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad." They walked together to the car, the city lights of New York glittering around them like a promise. As they settled into the back seat, Elijah handed Gregory the apology letter and the gift journal. "Look at this," he said, and his father read the framed apology from Continental Wings aloud, each syllable echoing justice served. Later that evening, back at the Johnson home in Manhattan, Elijah placed the travel journal on his bedside table and pinned the apology letter beside the framed family portraits. He lay in bed replaying every moment of the flight. The sneers, the taunts, the heart-pounding call to Daddy, the stern arrival of Robert Evans, and the final hush of victory. He realized that this one flight had changed him forever, not because of the hate he endured, but because of how he rose above it. He closed his eyes, feeling a calm certainty that no insult, no threat, and no amount of prejudice could ever diminish his worth. And in the quiet of his room, he drifted to sleep with a steady heartbeat, already dreaming of how he would share this story with future generations. A story of dignity, justice, and the unshakable power of standing one's ground. That night, somewhere high above the Atlantic, Flight 507 continued on its journey. And on board, the memory of a 15-year-old boy's courage lingered as the most powerful thing in first class. The airport terminal buzzed with activity as Elijah Johnson and his father Gregory Johnson stepped into the arrival hall. Bright fluorescent lights gleamed off polished floors, and travelers wheeled suitcases behind them. Yet everywhere Elijah looked, people paused and stared. Some with admiration, others with simple relief that justice had been served. As they approached the press area, a semicircle of cameras clicked and whirred. Reporters leaned forward, sour-faced after a long morning shift, yet their eyes softened when they saw Elijah's calm smile. "Mr. Johnson," called a reporter from Travel Weekly, "what do you want to say to other young people facing prejudice?" Elijah took a steadying breath. He pictured the young students who had written him letters overnight. "I want them to know they are not alone," he said clearly, his voice carrying through the microphones. "Dignity is something no one can take from you unless you let them. Stand firm, speak your truth, and trust that the right people will support you." Flashbulbs popped as his words echoed across the hall. After the brief session, Gregory guided Elijah through a side door into a private suite where airline executives had arranged a small reception. A banner read, "Continental Wings Airlines presents with justice and dignity." Platters of fruit and tiny sandwiches stood untouched because everyone was waiting for Elijah to speak again. Deborah Lane, now promoted to Senior Customer Experience Manager, approached with relief shining on her face. "Elijah, thank you again for how well you handled everything," she said, offering a warm handshake. "I hope you'll join us in our new training program. We want you to help teach our crew about respect and self-worth." Elijah nodded, honored that his ordeal could spark real change. He agreed to record a short video message for flight attendants, reminding them why zero tolerance for discrimination mattered. Meanwhile, Evelyn Stokes stood in another corner, escorted by two airline representatives. Her Platinum Elite card had been revoked permanently, and she now wore an economy boarding pass with a printed note explaining her seat demotion. A corner of her designer coat brushed the floor as she tried to keep her composure, but her eyes were glassy. Photographers spotted her and snapped pictures of her forlorn expression. Social media erupted with posts showing side-by-side shots of Elijah's dignified stance and Evelyn's scowl. Memes circulated overnight, some humane, some mocking, but most carried the same message. Entitled power falls when it clashes with principle. Back at Johnson Innovations headquarters later that afternoon, Gregory and Elijah entered a sleek boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The board members rose to applaud as they arrived. Elijah flushed slightly, unaccustomed to corporate fanfare, but he smiled and waved. Gregory took the head of the table and motioned for the team to sit. "Today we celebrate my son's courage," he began, voice resonating through the chamber. "But we must also turn this moment into sustained action. Effective immediately, Johnson Innovations will partner with Continental Wings to fund a scholarship for students who have faced discrimination. We will match every dollar the airline invests, up to $1 million. Together, we can ensure no young person ever thinks prejudice is acceptable. The board erupted in enthusiastic applause. Elijah glanced around at the faces of engineers and executives who usually talked in technical jargon. Today, they spoke in heartfelt agreement. The CFO, a woman named Angela Price, stood and said, "This is the proudest day in our company's history. We stand with you, Elijah." The room hummed with energy as laptops opened and email chains formed. Elijah felt a rush of purpose. What began as a cruel incident on a plane was blossoming into a movement backed by one of the world's leading tech firms. That evening, Elijah's school principal invited him to address the student body at an assembly the next day. He imagined walking onto a stage filled with peers, some curious, some uncertain, and sharing how a 15-year-old kid rose above meanness. He pictured the auditorium lights reflecting on rows of benches, the hush as he took the mic. He rehearsed in his head, "Sometimes you have to stand alone before people stand with you." The thought made him both nervous and exhilarated. Meanwhile, on a less fortunate trajectory, Evelyn returned home, a sprawling suburban estate with ornate gates and marble pillars. Yet she found no solace there. Her husband paced the foyer, his tailored suit unbuttoned at the top button, face drawn. He had seen the headlines screaming his wife's disgrace. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "this is a nightmare. Have you considered a public apology?" He looked around her luxuriously silent home, and for the first time felt the hollow echo of her own greed. She refused to apologize, but her silence said more than any mea culpa could. Guests who had once clamored for dinner invitations now declined politely. Invitations to country club events ceased arriving. At night, she lay awake under silk sheets, his threats to sue a distant echo she no longer believed could save her. Back in his hometown, Elijah continued to juggle homework, soccer practice, and community events. Each time he walked into a classroom or stepped on a field, he carried with him the memory of Seat 1A and the image of Evelyn's defeated glare. He also carried gratitude for every kind person who supported him. Every time he saw a friend reach out to someone else who needed it, he remembered why it all mattered. By the end of the month, the airline reported a 10% drop in in-flight complaints related to discrimination. Continental Wing's CEO issued a public statement praising Elijah's courage and announcing that every flight attendant would undergo mandatory empathy training. The story made international headlines, shifting from scandal to inspiration. Even competitors reached out to partner on similar programs. On crisp Saturday, Elijah and Gregory flew again on Continental Wings, but this time in first class together. Gregory had arranged for a small celebration on board, a personalized menu with Elijah's name on it, a congratulatory card from the airline's president, and a quiet toast with sparkling cider. Elijah raised his glass and looked out the window at clouds drifting like cotton. "I never thought a seat could change my life," he said. Gregory smiled. "Seats, like moments, shape us if we let them. I am proud of the man you are becoming." The flight attendant, passing by, greeted them with respect. Deborah had arranged it so that Elijah could see how much had changed. Elijah noticed other passengers smiling at him, some nodding in recognition. For the first time in weeks, he relaxed completely, confident that dignity and justice endure long after a flight has ended. Months later, Elijah sat at a polished oak desk in the study of his grandparents' home in Oak Brook, Illinois. He tapped away at a laptop, drafting the first chapter of his memoir titled Dignity in 1A. He wrote about the soft leather of the seat, the cool glass of juice, and the moment Evelyn's voice shattered his calm. Each word reminded him that stories could heal wounds. He paused and reflected on the journey from humiliation to hope. Then he typed the next sentence. "Courage is not absence of fear, but the refusal to run from it." His mother peeked in with a tray of hot cocoa and graham crackers. "Taking a break?" she asked. Elijah smiled and accepted the mug. The familiar aroma of cinnamon and chocolate brought comfort. "Just a short one," he promised. She ruffled his hair affectionately and disappeared. Elijah sipped the cocoa, thinking how far he'd come from that tense cabin. Meanwhile, Evelyn Stokes found herself confined to the economic seats of Continental Wings whenever she had to travel. Her Platinum Elite status remained revoked. She had tried apologizing once in an email, but the reply was a terse statement that her account would not be reinstated. She attempted to join a social club in Palm Beach, only to have her application rejected after board members whispered about her public incident. Invitations to charity galas ceased arriving. Her name no longer commanded respect. One day, she sat in gate seating, looking around at the same passengers she once lorded over, but now she couldn't meet their eyes. She felt as exposed as if she were standing in seat 1A again, only this time with everyone judging her cruelty. At Johnson Innovations, Elijah's scholarship fund blossomed. Applications flooded in from across the country. A young woman from Louisiana described being harassed for her accent. A teenager from California wrote about prejudice in his rural school. Each letter moved Elijah to tears. He and Gregory carefully reviewed each application, then hosted video chats to encourage each student personally. Elijah found purpose in mentorship and realized that sharing his story could inspire genuine change in hearts and policies. One evening, Gregory and Elijah attended a gala at the United Nations headquarters in New York City. The event honored human rights champions under 30 and featured activists from 5 continents. Elijah felt awed as he sat among people who had fought discrimination in war zones and political prisons. When his turn came to speak, he climbed the stage steps in a crisp navy suit and faced a crowd of diplomats, dignitaries, and press. "My fight started on a plane," he began, "but we all carry a flight within us, a journey toward justice and respect." He spoke for 10 minutes on the power of everyday courage. At the end, ambassadors rose to applaud, some wiping tears. Representatives of airlines worldwide approached him, asking how they could implement similar programs. Elijah realized that one boy's refusal to move had sparked a global dialogue on in-flight discrimination. Back home, Deborah Lane received an email from Continental Wings' president. It contained a budget for expanding the empathy training she had pioneered. It also announced her promotion to Director of Global Customer Relations. Deborah shared the news with her family over dinner. Her young daughter hugged her and said, "Mom, you are my hero." Deborah choked back tears, remembering that shaky moment in the cabin when she first sided with prejudice. Now she led an entire airline toward respect and inclusion. Evelyn Stokes, meanwhile, tried to rebuild her social standing. She hired a public relations consultant who coached her on image management. She drafted letters to charity boards extolling her philanthropic intentions, but her words rang hollow. People remembered her cruelty more than her money. One gala invitation arrived with a note, "We welcome donations, but not donors who disrespect children." Evelyn's empire of status had crumbled on the wings of one child's dignity. At school, Elijah graduated with honors. His classmates gave him a standing ovation at commencement. The valedictorian speech he delivered echoed the themes of his flight: self-respect, empathy, and the power to change systems from the inside out. He announced plans to study law and public policy, hoping to advocate for civil rights. Many wiped tears as he spoke of Seat 1A and the moment he chose to stay put. That summer, he interned at a civil rights law firm. His first assignment was organizing pro bono clinics for victims of discrimination. He listened to stories of unfair firings, housing denials, and hate speech. He used his own experience to comfort clients, reminding them that standing up to injustice could spark systemic reform. His supervisors praised his empathy and resolve. Years later, Elijah returned to Continental Wings to sit on a panel about corporate responsibility. The conference hall was packed with executives from travel, tech, and government sectors. He spoke about how policies mattered only when enforced with empathy. He shared data showing a 60% drop in discriminatory incidents since the 1A training program launched. He introduced a new initiative, pairing young advocates with airline leadership to review passenger feedback in real time. Executives snapped notes and nodded vigorously. Throughout his life, whenever prejudice threatened to go unchecked, people remembered the story of Seat 1A. They remembered that dignity belongs to everyone, regardless of age or background. And they remembered that one person's courage can change the world. One flight, one scholarship, one act of standing firm. Elijah sat frozen as Robert Evans cleared his throat and adjusted his collar, his presence filling the entire cabin like a sudden gust of wind. After verifying the facts, Evans began, his voice ringing out so every passenger could hear. We have decided to suspend Flight Supervisor Deborah Lane and Attendant Greg Thompson immediately for their unprofessional conduct, bias, and failure to protect a passenger's legal rights. The words landed like a thunderclap. Elijah's heart pounded as he watched Deborah's face drain of color. Her eyes widened, her lips quivered, and for the first time, the confident supervisor seemed powerless. Greg's usual composure shattered too. He stepped back as if struck, his name tag clinking against the bulkhead. A heavy silence fell over first class. Passengers stared at Deborah and Greg in disbelief, murmurs rising like a slow tide. Deborah swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper as she tried to defend herself. Mr. Evans, I was only trying to avoid a delay. I never meant to favor anyone. But Evans raised a hand, his gaze steely. This decision was made after careful review. He said, you knowingly sided with an abusive passenger instead of safeguarding the rightful seat of a young traveler. That is unacceptable. Greg attempted to speak, his voice cracking with shame. But sir, I was following orders, he protested. I didn't want to escalate things. Matthew Hughes, standing beside Evans, spoke next, his tone firm but even. Mr. Thompson, as a flight attendant, you are entrusted to uphold every passenger's rights equally. You remained silent while a child was humiliated. That breach of duty cannot stand. Elijah felt a swell of pity for Deborah and Greg, but he also understood that justice had to be served. At that moment, 2 uniformed security officers entered the cabin, their expressions grim. The lead officer stepped forward and addressed Deborah. Ma'am, please gather your belongings and come with us. Deborah's mouth opened again in protest, but she found no words. She glanced back at Elijah, her eyes filled with desperation and regret. Greg followed, his shoulders hunched, each step echoing down the aisle under the curious and shocked gazes of fellow passengers. As the cabin door closed behind them, the tension lifted like a drawn breath. Passengers exchanged relieved looks, some offering Elijah supportive smiles. But barely a heartbeat passed before Evelyn Stokes, her face flushed with rage, marched toward Evans. Her voice cut through the murmur like broken glass. This is outrageous, she hissed. I am a Platinum Elite customer. You cannot fire your staff just because I exercise my rights. I demand to meet the captain right now. Her finger jabbed at Evans's chest as if she could scare him into compliance. Evans exchanged a quiet nod with Hughes before replying, his tone polite yet unwavering. If you wish to speak with the captain, we will arrange that. Please wait here. He gestured toward the center of the cabin and stepped back. Evelyn planted her feet and folded her arms, her eyes flashing with defiance. Passengers watched, torn between annoyance at her tantrum and relief that the situation was unfolding properly. A moment later, the cockpit door opened and Captain Thomas Reynolds entered with measured strides. He wore his hat with effortless authority, his uniform crisp and unwrinkled. As soon as he appeared, the cabin grew still. Reynolds's calm eyes swept over the assembled passengers, lingering briefly on Elijah before settling on Evelyn. I am Captain Reynolds, he announced, his voice a firm echo that brooked no argument. I understand there is a dispute over Seat 1A. Who would like to present their case? Evelyn leaped forward, her words tumbling out in a sharp rush. "Captain, I am Evelyn Stokes. I have flown first class for decades and always sit in seat 1A. A child took my seat and your staff sided with him. That is an insult I cannot accept." She paused, her chest heaving with indignation. Reynolds listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he turned to Evans. "Has this been fully verified?" Evans nodded. Seat 1A was legitimately reserved for Mr. Johnson. Mrs. Stokes had no right to demand its surrender. Reynolds then faced Evelyn again, his voice low but unwavering. "Mrs. Stokes, your loyalty is appreciated, but loyalty does not trump legality or common courtesy. Seat assignments are based on valid tickets, not status alone. Mr. Johnson has every right to remain in seat 1A for the duration of this flight." Evelyn's jaw dropped, disbelief flickering across her features. She opened her mouth to protest, but Reynolds raised a hand. "Any further disturbance will risk the safety and order of this flight. I will not hesitate to remove anyone who refuses to comply." His final words hung in the air like a gavel striking a bench. The cabin was deathly silent as passengers absorbed the verdict. Elijah felt a surge of relief and pride. He met Reynolds's gaze and offered a small nod of thanks. The captain inclined his head ever so slightly, then turned on his heel and returned to the cockpit. Grace and justice had triumphed over arrogance and prejudice. Evelyn stood motionless for a few heartbeats, her mind racing. Then, in a last gasp of defiance, she thrust out her chin and shouted, "This is disgraceful. Who do you think you are, treating me like this?" A few passengers groaned, others sighed wearily. They had endured her outburst long enough. But Evelyn seemed oblivious to their discomfort, her fury still the only force she knew how to wield. Elijah sat quietly, hands folded, his face calm. He felt the weight of every glance in the cabin, some sympathetic, some impatient. But he also felt something stronger, the collective relief that fairness had been restored. The flight attendant soon reappeared to resume service, and Deborah Lane and Greg Thompson were nowhere in sight, their seats now vacant symbols of accountability. As the engines hummed steadily, Elijah looked out the window at the soft pink clouds trailing behind the wing. He thought of his father's words, that dignity and courage are the greatest measures of a person. Today, he had seen those qualities validated by the highest authority on the plane. He returned his gaze inside, where passengers were settling back with whispered conversations about integrity and respect. Evelyn at last sank into a seat far from 1A, her face buried in a silk scarf. The seat beside her remained empty, a silent testament to her defeat. Others had spoken quietly about supporting Elijah's scholarship fund, and some reached out to offer him snacks and water, a humble gesture of solidarity. The rest of the flight passed uneventfully. Elijah accepted a warm towel and a cup of tea from the returning attendant, and he allowed himself to relax for the first time since boarding. He closed his eyes briefly and reflected on the day's drama, from the harsh insult that first ignited the conflict to the stern intervention that ended it. He knew he had not only claimed his rightful seat, but also reminded everyone on board that common decency matters more than titles and perks. When the seatbelt sign finally turned off, a ripple of gratitude passed through first class. Elijah noticed even the typically aloof business travelers nodding at him as they grabbed carry-ons. He smiled back, quietly proud that his calm resolve had changed so many minds. Later, as the plane descended toward New York, Elijah imagined writing about this moment in his memoir. How a 15-year-old boy had stood firm against prejudice and arrogance, backed by justice and decency. He thought about how a seat assignment had become a battleground for dignity, and how it had ended with the strongest message possible. Fairness is the true measure of power. And so, As the runway lights flickered below and the engines whined in a soft crescendo, Elijah Johnson prepared to land, not just as a passenger who had won a seat, but as someone who had claimed a lesson in respect that would last a lifetime. Elijah sat rigidly in his seat as Evelyn Stokes planted herself in the aisle, pointing an accusing finger at Captain Thomas Reynolds and the two senior representatives. Her voice rang out, sharp and threatening. "Do you even know who you are insulting?" she demanded, her tone dripping with venom. "I will make sure this airline pays dearly for this rude behavior. I will call every major newspaper and my lawyer right now. Your reputation will be completely ruined." The passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some shielding their children's ears, others pressing a hand to their temples as the unsettling scene continued to unfold. The cabin buzzed with murmurs of discomfort, but Evelyn seemed to feed off the attention. She stood tall, her platinum blonde hair catching the reading lights overhead, her designer coat trailing just enough on the carpet to gather everyone's gaze. A few travelers shifted in their seats, checking watches and silently pleading for the uproar to end. Captain Reynolds advanced a step into the aisle, his face calm but his eyes steel blue. With authority that settled the cabin like a weight, he spoke in a firm voice that still carried kindness. "Mrs. Stokes, disruptive behavior will not be tolerated," he said. "Please sit back down at once, or we will be forced to ask you to leave the aircraft." Evelyn's lips curled in contempt as she ignored the captain's warning. She turned to the passengers as if rallying an army to her cause. "Can you believe this?" she cried. "A loyal Platinum Elite customer is forced to endure this humiliation because of a child. Do you think this is the kind of airline you want to fly with?" Her words stung the air, and some passengers looked down, uncomfortable with the implied guilt she'd tried to cast on them. A tall man in a navy suit finally spoke, mustering enough courage to address her directly. "Ma'am, please sit down," he said quietly. "We all want this flight to depart on time." At his words, Evelyn whirled around, fury burning in her pale blue eyes. "What are you saying?" she snapped. "I am the victim of an unforgivable injustice. Why should I stay silent while my rights are trampled?" Her voice crescendoed, echoing off the overhead bins, and the cabin felt like a pressure cooker moments from blowing its lid. Elijah felt a knot tighten in his chest at the hateful light in her eyes. He gripped the armrests, trying to remain as composed as he had all flight long. Captain Reynolds signaled to the two uniformed security officers standing near the front galley. They stepped forward, expressions unreadable behind polished badges. With calm but firm certainty, Reynolds addressed Evelyn. "Mrs. Stokes, this is my final decision," he said. "If you do not cooperate, we will have to take stronger measures to ensure the safety and order of this flight. You will be asked to leave the plane if you continue this disturbance." His words landed like an ultimatum, and for a brief moment, Evelyn's arrogance faltered. Her cheeks flushed the color of the airline's burgundy carpet, her breath catching as she weighed her pride against reality. Security felt no hesitation in her heart, yet her imperious nature refused to bow. She stood rigid with trembling hands, her Chanel handbag clutched like a life preserver. Every passenger watched, some with pity, others with resentment at her stubbornness. Elijah sensed the all but invisible tension thread the entire cabin together, each heart silently waiting for Evelyn's next move. The cabin fell into a taut silence so powerful it felt physical. Then Robert Evans, the senior airline representative with silver hair and a perfectly tailored navy suit, stepped forward and addressed Evelyn with a decisive voice that resonated through first class. "Mrs. Stokes, after a full review and documentation of your conduct, we are officially revoking your Platinum Elite status," he announced. "You violated our passenger regulations, disrupted the order and safety of this flight, and have impacted the comfort of all aboard. Effective immediately, your privileges are removed." His statement shattered the last of Evelyn's confidence and left the cabin in stunned disbelief. Evelyn's eyes widened in shock, her mouth forming a perfect O of outrage. "No, you can't do this to me," she shouted. "I have been platinum elite for years. I have spent tens of thousands of dollars on your airline. You have no right." But Evans remained unmoved. "Mrs. Stokes, privileges are earned by respect and adherence to rules," he replied calmly. "You forfeited yours when you chose intimidation and racism over courtesy and law." His reply held no hint of apology, only resolution and justice. For a second time, the cabin went eerily silent. Evelyn's lips curled into a strangled scream of frustration. "This is unacceptable," she roared, pointing wildly at Elijah. "You're standing with an unknown child against me. I will pay you back for this. I will sue you into bankruptcy." The passengers recoiled. Parents pulled children close, business travelers closed laptops, and flight crews watched from the galley in relief that the reckoning had finally arrived. Captain Reynolds stepped forward again, his tone now sharper and unmistakably final. "Mrs. Stokes, I want to reiterate that this decision is unchangeable. Please take your seat now and cease this disturbance," he said. "This is your last warning before airport security will have to remove you." His command left no room for argument. Evelyn's shoulders slumped as reality gripped her. She knew the captain would not hesitate to enforce his order. At that moment, two security officers moved in quietly. Their presence was calm but unyielding. Evelyn looked from them to Captain Reynolds, eyes wild with desperation. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words emerged. Instead, she sank into the nearest seat, hands trembling, nose flaring. The cabin exhaled collectively. Travelers leaned against their headrests, the strain finally lifting as order restored itself. Elijah watched this fall from grace with mixed emotions. He felt compassion for Evelyn's downfall and anger at her cruelty. He realized that her desperate threats had only served to expose her lack of true power. Justice had not only been upheld, but had shone brightly for everyone to see. Her removal, though humiliating, was a necessary act to protect the dignity of every person on board, especially a 15-year-old boy simply sitting in the seat his father had reserved. A hush settled as the cabin crew resumed service. Warm towels were offered to Elijah, and a soft breeze from the air vents felt soothing after the suffocating tension. Passengers whispered congratulations to each other, nodding in mutual acknowledgement that fairness had prevailed. Elijah accepted a cup of lemonade from a smiling attendant, tears of relief welling in his eyes. He allowed himself a quiet moment of pride and gratitude for the captain, the senior representatives, and the airline's decision to value justice over privilege. As the seatbelt sign faded and the flight prepared to descend, Elijah reflected on how quickly a peaceful journey had erupted into chaos and then resolved itself through the steady hands of leadership and rule of law. He thought of his father Gregory's words about courage and dignity and realized that this moment would be with him always. He looked out the window at the soft glow of the sunset, feeling a calm certainty that integrity and respect would guide him wherever he traveled next. Elijah remained seated as the two security officers gently but firmly guided Evelyn Stokes toward the cabin door. Her frantic protests echoed off the overhead bins. Threats of lawsuits, promises to ruin the airline's reputation, but each step took her farther from power and closer to ultimate humiliation. As the door closed behind her, a heavy silence settled over first class, broken only by the soft hiss of the air vents. Passengers exchanged relieved glances and whispered words of sympathy for Elijah. A middle-aged woman next to him leaned over and said softly, "You did the right thing, young man. Never let anyone treat you that way." Elijah offered a small, grateful smile, acknowledging the kindness that made him feel less alone after such a tense ordeal. Moments later, Robert Evans approached with a warm, respectful tone. "Elijah, on behalf of our entire leadership team, I apologize for what you endured today. We are committed to overhauling our policies and training so that no passenger suffers such injustice again." Elijah looked into Evans's eyes and replied with quiet confidence, "Thank you, sir. Recognizing mistakes and taking concrete action is what truly matters." With that, Captain Reynolds announced the flight was ready for takeoff. Engines roared to life, and as the plane lifted smoothly into the night sky, Elijah gazed out the window at the runway lights below. In his heart, he felt his father's unwavering support, proof that integrity and courage always guide us home.